Memphis, late 1960s. The streets are half empty, the night heavy with the scent of fried food and gasoline. Outside a worn-down movie theater, a thin boy of 9 huddles against the brick wall. His sweater is torn, his sneakers without laces. He presses his arms tight to his chest, trying to steal warmth from the cold air. From the open door of a nearby cafe, a radio hums. The boy mouths the words of the song drifting out. Can't help falling in love. His whisper is fragile, yet desperate, as though the melody is the only thread keeping him anchored to the world. Headlights sweep across the sidewalk. A black Cadillac slows, its engine purring low. The door opens. A tall figure steps out, coat collar raised, hat brim casting his face in shadow. Yet the outline is unmistakable. Elvis Presley. For a heartbeat, time freezes. The world-famous king of rock stands still, staring at the shivering boy who dares to sing his song into the night. But what happens next? No one on that street, not even Elvis himself, could have foreseen. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. Part 1. The meeting Memphis after midnight had a way of swallowing sound. The streets glowed in neon, signs buzzing above shuttered diners and pawn shops, their paint peeling under decades of sun and rain. The air carried the sharp tang of gasoline mixed with the sweetness of roasted peanuts sold by a vendor who had packed up hours ago but left the smell lingering like a memory. A city bus hissed to a stop across the intersection, its cabin empty except for a driver leaning against the wheel with his eyes half closed, waiting for passengers that would not come. Elvis had left Graceland that night without telling anyone. No entourage, no flashing lights. Just him, a jacket pulled tight, and the restlessness that sometimes forced him to wander the streets of the city he once called home. Fame had never softened that ache inside him. Some nights, walking alone among strangers gave him more peace than the gilded halls of his mansion. That was when he heard it. A thin voice, carried almost as a whisper, drifting from the shadows near a boarded-up grocery store. The sound was fragile, like it might vanish with the next gust of wind. Yet the words were unmistakable. Love me tender, love me sweet, never let me go. Elvis stopped in his tracks. His chest tightened. Whoever sang those words did it without polish or bravado. It was raw, almost trembling, and it cut straight through him. He stepped closer. In the dim glow of a flickering street lamp, he saw a boy no older than 12. The child sat curled against the wall, knees pulled to his chest, a threadbare jacket draped over his shoulders. His face was half hidden beneath tangled hair, and his voice was so quiet it seemed meant only for himself. Elvis crouched down a few feet away, not wanting to frighten him. "Son," he said softly, "that's a fine song you're singing." The boy's head jerked up. His eyes widened, panic flashing across his face. For a second he froze, then he scrambled to his feet and bolted down the sidewalk. "Wait!" Elvis called after him. But the boy ran faster, weaving between lampposts and trash bins. Elvis followed, his shoes slapping against the pavement, breath clouding in the cool night air. He hadn't chased anyone in years, not since running through the backyards of Tupelo as a barefoot kid. His heart pounded harder than it did on stage. The boy turned into an alley but found the gate at the end chained shut. He pressed himself against it, chest heaving. Elvis slowed, raising both hands as if approaching a frightened animal. "I ain't here to hurt you," he said gently. "You got my word." The boy shook his head violently. "You'll call the cops." "They'll send me away." His voice cracked with desperation. Elvis stepped closer until the glow from the streetlight revealed his face. The boy's mouth parted in shock. Recognition dawned, followed by even deeper fear. "You're him," the child whispered. "You'll tell them. They'll lock me up." Elvis felt something twist inside him. Fame usually brought adoration or greed, not terror. He knelt so they were eye level. "No police. Just me and you. That's all." The boy hesitated, then his shoulders slumped. He looked at the ground, voice dropping to almost nothing. "I ain't got nowhere else to go. Mama. She passed last winter. Daddy's been gone longer than I can remember. Since then, it's just the streets Elvis swallowed hard." For a moment, the neon and asphalt around him blurred, replaced by a memory of Tupelo dirt roads, of his mother's thin hands folding worn shirts, of nights when supper was nothing but cornbread and tears. He saw himself at 10 years old, watching his parents pawn furniture to keep the lights on, praying the landlord would show mercy. The boy's words pierced deeper than any critic or crowd ever could. It wasn't a stranger's story. It was his own reflection. "What's your name, son?" Elvis asked quietly. The child shifted on his feet. "Jimmy." "Well, Jimmy," Elvis said, his voice catching, "seems to me you got a lot of courage singing out here. You remind me of a boy I used to know, poor as dirt. But he sang anyway. That boy was me." Jimmy's eyes flickered with confusion, as if trying to believe the man in front of him wasn't a dream. Elvis felt a heaviness settle in his chest. For years he had been the king. Silk suits, gold records, screaming crowds. But in that moment, stripped of the glitter, he was just a man staring at a mirror held up by a homeless child. The city around them remained silent, except for the buzz of neon and the distant hum of the Mississippi River. Somewhere in the darkness, a dog barked once and then quieted. The boy's breathing slowed, though suspicion still lingered in his gaze. Elvis didn't press further. He simply sat down on the cold pavement, leaning his back against the wall beside Jimmy. The concrete stung through his jacket, but he didn't move. He wanted the boy to see that he wasn't leaving. For several long moments, neither spoke. Then, barely audible, Jimmy muttered, "I thought if I kept singing, maybe Mama could hear me. She always liked your songs." Elvis closed his eyes. A lump rose in his throat. He thought of Gladys, the way she used to sit on the porch humming hymns, how she'd cried the day he left for the army, how she'd never lived to see what he became. Loss had carved a hollow inside him that never truly filled, no matter the applause. He opened his eyes, looking at Jimmy not as a fan, not as a burden, but as the living echo of that hollow. "You keep singing, son," Elvis said softly. "Don't ever stop." Jimmy turned his head slightly, studying him in the faint glow. The fear in his eyes didn't vanish, but it shifted into something else. The first fragile spark of trust. And in that quiet Memphis alley, under the tired light of a flickering bulb, Elvis Presley, the man who filled stadiums, found himself stripped of all titles, face to face with a boy who carried his own childhood in his bones. It was no longer about fame or even music. It was about two souls, both abandoned in different ways, finding each other in the shadows. The streets of Memphis stretched quiet, broken only by the occasional rumble of a passing car. Elvis stood beside Jimmy, unsure how to bridge the silence. The boy's shoulders were drawn tight, his eyes darting toward the shadows as if expecting someone to chase him away at any moment. Hunger clung to his thin frame, a restlessness that Elvis recognized too well. "Tell you what," Elvis said gently, slipping his hands into his jacket pockets. "There's a diner open all night, just 2 blocks from here. They've got warm food, and I'm guessing you haven't eaten in a while. How about you and me go there?" Jimmy stiffened. His voice carried suspicion sharpened by years of disappointment. I don't need nobody's pity. Folks say they'll help, then they take what little I got. Or they laugh. Elvis nodded, understanding the sting behind those words. Fair enough. I'm not here to trick you, son. Just a meal. That's all. You don't owe me anything. For a long moment, Jimmy studied him, eyes narrow. The city's neon glow painted Elvis's face, making him look less like the figure on billboards and more like a tired man speaking honestly. Finally, Jimmy muttered, If you're lying, I'm gone. Deal, Elvis replied. They walked side by side down the cracked sidewalk, past darkened storefronts and bus stops littered with newspapers. When they pushed through the glass door of the diner, a bell jingled overhead. The smell of frying bacon and coffee washed over them. Fluorescent lights hummed against the low chatter of a few late-night customers. Jimmy slid into a booth, reluctantly, hugging himself as though expecting to be thrown out. Elvis sat across from him, stretching his legs beneath the table. He was almost invisible without his entourage, but it took only a heartbeat before the waitress stopped short, eyes wide. Lord have mercy, she whispered, hand flying to her mouth. Mr. Presley? Elvis gave her a small smile, pressing a finger to his lips. Evening, ma'am? Just hoping for some peace and a bite to eat. Think you can help me out with that? She nodded rapidly, her eyes darting between him and the boy. The bell over the door chimed again, and word spread quickly. A pair of truckers at the counter leaned over, whispering. One pulled out a camera. Elvis's jaw tightened. This was exactly what he hadn't wanted. Jimmy shrank into the booth, his knuckles white against the edge of the table. The attention pressed down on him like a weight. Menu? The waitress asked, trying to regain composure. 2 burgers, fries, and milkshakes, Elvis answered firmly. Make 1 chocolate. He winked at Jimmy. That sound all right to you, partner? The boy gave a tiny nod, though his lips stayed sealed. Whispers rippled across the room. A man at the far end, his voice louder than necessary, snorted. What's the king of rock and roll doin' sittin' with a street urchin? Ain't got better company? The laughter that followed scraped like broken glass. Jimmy's face burned crimson, his eyes fixed on the tabletop. Elvis leaned forward, his own voice sharp enough to cut through the diner's noise. That boy's got more backbone singing on a cold sidewalk than some men show their whole lives. Don't you forget it? The room fell silent. The man who had spoken shifted uncomfortably, muttering something into his coffee. Elvis's words hung in the air, not shouted, but solid, unshakable. Jimmy blinked at him, surprise flickering across his face. No one had ever stood up for him before. Not like that. For the first time, he sat a little taller in the booth. The food arrived, steaming and fragrant. Jimmy hesitated, glancing at Elvis as though waiting for permission. Go on, son, Elvis urged. Eat. The boy picked up the burger with trembling hands and bit into it, closing his eyes as if the taste itself was overwhelming. Elvis watched quietly, his heart aching at the sight of a child savoring something as simple as dinner. He remembered nights when he and his mama had split a single sandwich, pretending it was enough. Across the diner, customers tried to sneak glances without being obvious. Some were starstruck, but others watched with puzzled expressions, as if trying to reconcile the glittering star with the man calmly sharing fries with a ragged boy. Elvis ignored them. He focused only on Jimmy, asking small questions between bites. How long you been out here? Got a place you like to stay? The boy answered in short, guarded sentences. Underneath, though, Elvis sensed the beginnings of trust. Fragile, but real. The milkshake glass clinked as Jimmy set it down. A faint mustache of chocolate clung to his lip. Elvis chuckled softly, sliding a napkin across the table. Jimmy wiped his face quickly, embarrassed. But when he looked up, there was the smallest curve of a smile. For a fleeting moment, it felt like they were simply two people in a diner. Nothing more. No spotlight, no rumors, no past. Just a man and a boy, bound by hunger and the memory of loneliness. But Elvis knew the quiet wouldn't last. Eyes still followed them. Voices whispered. And outside, the world of headlines and gossip waited like wolves at the door. He leaned back in the booth, watching Jimmy polish off the last of his fries. Something had shifted. This wasn't charity anymore. It was a test of trust, of patience, of whether Jimmy could believe in someone again. And Elvis felt the weight of it press against him, heavier than any gold record he'd ever held. The diner's neon sign hummed faintly as Elvis and Jimmy stepped back into the Memphis night. The air was cooler now, brushing against their faces with the damp promise of the river just a few blocks away. The sidewalks gleamed under the street lamps where rain had fallen earlier, leaving shallow puddles that caught reflections of passing headlights. Jimmy walked a half-step behind, his arms wrapped around himself, as if the weight of food in his stomach made him uneasy. A reminder that it wasn't something he could count on tomorrow. Elvis slowed his stride, giving the boy space, yet refusing to let him drift away. They turned down a quieter street, where the flickering light of an old movie theater marquee spilled across the pavement. The posters in the glass case were faded, corners curling. Jimmy's gaze lingered on them. "You like the pictures?" Elvis asked softly. The boy shrugged, his voice rough. "Used to sneak in sometimes. Sat in the dark, way in the back, 'cause nobody noticed me there. They showed those old movies with you in 'em." His words quickened, nervous. Didn't matter that folks laughed at the corny parts. When I watched, it felt like maybe home wasn't so far away. Elvis stopped walking. The boy's honesty struck him harder than any crowd's applause ever had. "Home," he repeated quietly, tasting the word as though it carried both sweetness and pain. Jimmy kicked at a pebble on the sidewalk. "Ain't had one in a long time. But when the music started, it didn't matter. Could close my eyes and pretend Mama was still there. Pretend somebody cared." Elvis's throat tightened. He looked at the marquee, remembering nights in Tupelo, when the only escape from poverty was a nickel ticket at the movies. Back then, he'd watched heroes on screen and dreamed of being someone more than a factory boy's son. "You know," he said after a pause, "I wasn't born into palaces and spotlights. I grew up dirt poor, not so different from you. Lived in a house that leaked when it rained, sometimes didn't know if we'd eat that night. My mama, she carried me through. Without her, I don't reckon I'd have made it." Jimmy glanced up, eyes narrowing as though trying to measure truth against the glittering image of the man beside him. "But you. Everybody knows you. How could you ever be like me?" Elvis smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Because underneath all this," he gestured vaguely at the tailored jacket, "I still remember what it felt like to be hungry, to feel invisible. That part never leaves you." For a while they walked in silence, the night sounds filling the gaps. A distant train horn, the shuffle of someone sweeping inside a closing shop, the muffled hum of a jukebox leaking from a bar down the block. Jimmy's voice broke the quiet. "Could you sing something?" Elvis blinked. "Sing? Yeah, just for me." The boy's request was barely more than a whisper, but his eyes held steady, searching. Elvis hesitated. He had sung in front of presidents and sold-out arenas, but never had a request felt so weighty. Here was no screaming crowd, no bright spotlight, Just a child asking for proof that he mattered enough to be given a piece of music. He drew a slow breath, then leaned against a lamppost. His voice, when it came, was low and unpolished, stripped of the theatrics that fame demanded. "Are you lonesome tonight?" The words drifted into the stillness, carried only a few feet before melting into the night air. He didn't push the sound. He let it tremble, honest and fragile. Jimmy froze. His eyes widened, not with the awe of a fan, but with something deeper, the shock of being seen. The song wasn't a performance, it was a confession. Elvis's gaze stayed on the boy, his voice softening even more. "Do you miss me tonight? Are you sorry we drifted apart?" The lamplight pooled around them, catching in the ripples of water on the pavement. The distant neon flickered. No applause, no cameras, just a man singing into the emptiness for a boy who had lost everything. When he finished, silence stretched. Jimmy's lips parted, but no sound came. His small hands clenched at his sides, and though no tears fell, his eyes glistened with something raw and unspoken. For the first time since Elvis had met him, the boy didn't look like he was preparing to run. He looked anchored, not safe yet, not whole, but tethered to someone who cared enough to sing for him alone. Elvis pushed himself off the lamppost and gave a faint, almost shy smile. "Didn't think I'd be singing on a street corner at this hour. But you asked, and that makes it worth something." Jimmy's voice was husky when he finally spoke. "Nobody's ever done that for me." Elvis felt his own chest ache. "Then maybe tonight's a start." They stood there a moment longer, two shadows in the quiet Memphis street, joined not by fame or need, but by the fragile bridge of a song. And though Elvis couldn't yet see it, this was the moment when both their lives began to change. The city had begun to thin into silence, streetlights glowing like watchful sentries as Elvis guided Jimmy toward his car. The boy walked slowly, as though each step cost him a decision. He kept glancing at Elvis, as if trying to determine when the kindness might vanish, replaced by the rejection he had known too often. Inside the car, the leather seats creaked as Jimmy slid close to the door, arms folded tight. Elvis didn't push him. He simply turned the key, and the engine purred to life. Memphis rolled by outside the window. Brick storefronts, shuttered churches, the glow of a 24-hour laundromat. "Where we headed?" Jimmy asked warily. "Thought we'd try a shelter first," Elvis said. "Place a few blocks from here. They might have a bed for you." The boy's silence was answer enough. He'd been through this before. They pulled into a narrow side street where a squat building stood, its paint peeling, windows barred. A dim sign read, "Hope House." Elvis parked and placed a reassuring hand on Jimmy's shoulder. "Let's give it a try." The inside smelled of boiled cabbage and bleach. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, illuminating rows of worn cots. Behind a counter sat a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a stack of forms. She barely glanced up. "Full tonight." "We've got a waiting list." Elvis straightened, his voice calm but firm. "This boy's been out on the street. Surely there's—" "Sir," she interrupted, sliding her glasses down her nose. "We told him the same last week. He knows the rules. No space." Jimmy's gaze dropped to the floor, shame staining his face. Elvis looked at him, then back at the woman, his jaw tightening. "You're telling me a child's got to sleep under a bridge while beds sit here waiting for paperwork?" Her shoulders rose in a weary shrug. "It's policy." The words stung Elvis deeper than expected. He had built a life where doors opened at the sound of his name, yet here was a child barred by bureaucracy, dismissed as if he were nothing. A memory came rushing back. The day his family lost their Tupelo home. He was just a boy, standing in the dirt, while neighbors watched them pack what little they had into a truck. His mother's hands shook as she tried to smile, whispering promises she could barely believe herself. For years that shame had lived inside him, even beneath rhinestones and spotlights. And now, staring at Jimmy's slumped shoulders, he saw the same wound repeating. Elvis turned back to the counter, his voice low and edged with steel. "He's not invisible." Not tonight, but the woman's eyes remained indifferent. The conversation was over. Elvis placed a gentle hand on Jimmy's back and steered him outside. The cool air hit them like a release from a suffocating room. Jimmy wouldn't meet his eyes. "Told you," the boy muttered. "They don't want me." Elvis exhaled slowly, fighting down the helpless anger swelling inside him. He'd sung for presidents, filled arenas, but here he stood powerless against a locked door and a shrug. Unless he chose to defy it. "You're not sleeping on the street tonight," Elvis said firmly. Jimmy looked up, uncertain. "Then where?" Elvis hesitated only a heartbeat before answering. "With me." Jimmy's eyes widened, suspicion flashing. "What do you mean?" "I've got a hotel room downtown. Big enough for the both of us. You'll have a bed, hot water, the works, just for tonight. I won't leave you out here." The boy shook his head, almost in disbelief. "What if someone sees?" You're him. They'll think all kinds of things." Elvis gave a faint, rueful smile. "They'll think whatever they want, no matter what I do. But I can't drive away, knowing you're out here alone." Jimmy's silence stretched, broken only by the chirp of crickets in a nearby alley. Finally, he whispered, "Why?" Elvis's voice softened. "Because once upon a time, I was you. Hungry, scared, wondering if anybody cared. And if someone had reached out then, maybe Mama wouldn't have carried so much weight on her shoulders. I can't fix the world, son, but I can do something about tonight." For the first time, Jimmy's expression cracked, a flicker of relief, fragile as glass. They drove toward the downtown lights, the streets widening into boulevards lined with glowing signs and the hum of late-night traffic. Elvis felt the tension coil in his chest. He knew the risk. One photograph of him walking into a hotel with a homeless child, and the press would devour him alive. His manager would explode. The headlines would smear him. But what was reputation if it cost him his humanity? As they pulled into the hotel's underground lot, Elvis stole a glance at Jimmy. The boy's head leaned against the window, eyes heavy, body sagging with exhaustion. He looked so small against the expanse of the leather seat, as if swallowed by the world around him. Elvis tightened his grip on the wheel. This wasn't about pity or charity. It was about redemption. A chance to protect the reflection of the boy he once was, to give Jimmy the one thing Elvis had longed for when he was small. The simple assurance that he wasn't alone. The hotel room door clicked shut behind them, muting the muffled sounds of Memphis nightlife below. The suite was modest by Elvis's standards. 2 beds, a desk, heavy curtains drawn against the city lights. Still, to Jimmy, it looked like another world. The boy lingered just inside the doorway, his bare feet sinking into thick carpet. His eyes darted from the polished lamps to the patterned bedspread, to the bathroom door half open with the promise of hot water. He didn't move further, as though afraid he'd be punished for touching anything. Elvis dropped his jacket over a chair and motioned to the nearer bed. "That one's yours tonight." Jimmy shook his head quickly. "I can sleep on the floor." "You'll do no such thing," Elvis replied gently, a smile tugging at his lips. "Go on. Try it." After a pause, Jimmy edged toward the mattress and lowered himself onto the edge. The springs sighed softly beneath his weight. He bounced once, almost startled by the softness, then sat still, staring at his hands. Elvis sat across from him, lighting a cigarette. The glow flared briefly, then faded to a quiet ember. Smoke curled toward the ceiling, mixing with the hum of the air conditioner. "You all right?" he asked. Jimmy shrugged. "Feels strange." "Too quiet." Elvis nodded. "I know that feeling." Minutes passed before Jimmy spoke again, his voice hesitant. "I've been picking coins off sidewalks, begging outside stores. Saved up a little once. Enough to buy an old radio from a pawn shop. It barely worked, but sometimes it caught your songs. When the static cleared and I heard your voice, it was like someone out there knew I existed. Kept me from giving up." The boy's confession landed heavily in the quiet room. Elvis stubbed out his cigarette, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "You know," he said, voice lower now, "I used to clutch a little guitar my daddy bought on credit, cheap as could be, played till my fingers bled. Music was the only thing that made the hunger easier to bear. Mama—" He stopped, swallowing hard, then went on. "Mama believed in me even when no one else did. When I lost her, back in '58, it tore something out of me I never got back." Jimmy's eyes lifted, wide with surprise. He had only ever seen the singer on glossy posters, dazzling crowds. To hear him speak of loss so plainly made him human, in a way Jimmy hadn't imagined. "What was she like?" the boy asked quietly. Elvis smiled faintly, though it trembled at the edges. "Kind. Stronger than anyone knew. She could make a poor meal taste like a feast, make a shack feel like a palace. She's the reason I sing hymns when I'm lost. Feels like talking to her." The room grew still, the only sound the soft hum of the city beyond the window. Jimmy turned on the bed, curling onto his side but keeping his eyes on Elvis. His voice was almost a whisper. "I wish I had that. Mama used to sing too. Not fancy, just soft, so I could sleep. Now the nights are too long." Elvis rose without a word and crossed to the corner where his guitar case rested. He opened it carefully, like lifting the lid of something sacred. Sitting on the edge of the other bed, he tuned the strings with slow precision, the faint notes filling the silence like fragile threads. Jimmy's gaze fixed on him, unblinking. Elvis strummed softly, then began to sing. His voice carried none of the showman's fire, none of the polished bravado. Instead, it was worn, tender, cracked slightly at the edges. "There will be peace in the valley for me. Dear Lord, I pray." The hymn filled the room, rising gently above the hum of the air conditioner. Each note was a memory. His mother's hands folded in prayer. His own childhood fears soothed by her faith. Now he poured it into the air for Jimmy, as if passing on a piece of that comfort. The boy's breathing grew uneven. His small fists clenched in the sheets, then loosened. His eyes shone wet, though he didn't sob. The sound was too precious to interrupt. Elvis's voice deepened with the refrain, his eyes closed, his body swaying slightly with the rhythm. It wasn't a performance, it was communion. Between past and present, between a lost boy and a man still haunted by his own losses. When the final chord faded, silence settled heavy. Elvis opened his eyes to find Jimmy's face streaked with quiet tears. But there was something else there, too. The faintest glimmer of hope. "You sang that for her, didn't you?" Jimmy asked hoarsely. Elvis nodded, his voice thick. "Every time. And tonight, for you too." Jimmy turned onto his back, staring at the ceiling. Maybe I'll dream better tonight. Elvis set the guitar aside and dimmed the lamp. The room fell into half-darkness, lit only by the faint glow of the city through the curtains. He sat a while longer, watching the boy's breathing steady, listening to the fragile rhythm of sleep beginning to claim him. For Elvis, sleep rarely came easily. His own demons prowled the night. But sitting there, knowing Jimmy had found even a moment of peace, gave him a sense of quiet he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't glory, wasn't applause. It was something far rarer. The feeling that he had reached into the darkness and made it less lonely for someone else. And as the night stretched on, Elvis realized this was the kind of stage he had been searching for all along. Morning sunlight slipped between the heavy curtains, casting narrow beams across the hotel carpet. Elvis stirred first, accustomed to restless nights. Jimmy was still asleep in the other bed, curled beneath the blanket, his chest rising in steady rhythm. For the first time since Elvis had met him, the boy looked unguarded, almost peaceful. But peace didn't last long. By the time Elvis ordered breakfast, the phone in the suite rang sharply. He hesitated before picking it up. "Presley!" The voice on the other end was gravel mixed with fury. "You want to tell me why reporters are calling me before 8 in the morning, asking if the king spent the night with a stray kid in his hotel?" It was Colonel Tom Parker, his manager, the man who had steered his career for nearly 2 decades. Elvis pinched the bridge of his nose. "Colonel, keep your voice down." The boy's still sleeping. "The boy?" Parker nearly barked the word. "Do you have any idea what this looks like? Headlines, rumors, questions we don't need. You'll be torn apart, son. You walk away now, pretend it never happened." That's an order Elvis's jaw set. He had swallowed orders before, countless times, for the sake of tours and contracts, but something inside him snapped. "Not this time," he said quietly, with a weight that silenced even Parker for a moment. "I ain't abandoning him." "You're risking everything," Parker shot back. "Your reputation, your shows, your future. For what? Some homeless kid you don't even know?" Elvis's answer was steady. "Because somebody has to." He hung up before Parker could reply. Moments later, Jimmy stirred, rubbing his eyes. "Who was that?" "Business," Elvis said, forcing calm into his voice. "Nothing you need to worry about." But worry came soon enough. When they stepped into the lobby, whispers rose like sparks. A few fans had gathered, cameras flashing as soon as they saw him. Some cheered, others gawked, all of them staring at the small boy walking beside him. Jimmy froze, eyes wide, retreating behind Elvis's arm. "Don't mind them," Elvis murmured. He placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder and kept walking, though the barrage of questions followed them out the door. Outside, a group of fans broke into song, one of his old hits, their voices echoing across the street. At first, Jimmy flinched, but then he noticed they weren't mocking. They were smiling, some even waving at him, as if accepting his presence beside the king. His posture shifted slightly, shoulders less rigid. Still, tension pulsed in the air. A man with a camera shouted, "Who's the kid, Elvis? Your new project? Charity case?" Elvis stopped in his tracks, turning to face him. The crowd hushed. "This here's Jimmy," Elvis said firmly. "And he's not a case. He's not a headline. He's a boy who deserves better than the streets. That's all you need to know." His words carried not the polish of a press statement, but the edge of raw conviction. For a moment, even the reporters fell silent, unsure how to respond. They moved on quickly, but Jimmy clung closer to Elvis, whispering, "Why'd you say that? Won't they just make fun of you now?" "Let 'em," Elvis answered, voice low. What matters is you know someone's standing up for you. Back upstairs, Parker was waiting, arms crossed, face red with anger. You've lost your damn mind. I built you into the king, and you're about to throw it all away for some raggedy kid. Elvis's eyes darkened. You built the shows, Colonel, but the man who sings them, that's still me. And I decide who I walk beside. The confrontation stretched taut as wire. Parker's words dripped with venom. Then, don't come crying when they tear you apart. He stormed out, slamming the door. Silence followed. Jimmy sat on the edge of the bed, watching Elvis with a mix of confusion and awe. You argued with him. For me? Elvis crouched to meet his eyes. For you? And for the boy I used to be? The child didn't answer, but the way he sat a little taller spoke volumes. Later that afternoon, when they ventured downstairs again, something remarkable happened. A handful of fans in the lobby approached timidly. Instead of questions, one woman pressed a small bag of food into Jimmy's hands. For you, sweetheart, she said softly. Another knelt, smiling. Don't you worry. You're safe with him. Jimmy blinked, stunned. For once, the stares didn't mean ridicule. They meant acceptance. As Elvis watched the boy's face, he realized the choice had already been made. He could bow to Parker's demands, guard his reputation, and leave Jimmy behind. Or he could stand firm, risk scandal, and give the boy the safety no one else had offered. The answer was clear. That night, alone again in the room, Elvis looked at Jimmy sleeping and whispered into the quiet, You're not going back to the streets, not while I got breath in me. The decision sealed itself in his chest, heavier than any crown of fame. The following morning carried a heavy stillness. Elvis had barely slept, but his decision was made. He couldn't just offer Jimmy a night of comfort and then send him back to the alleys. That would be cruelty, dressed as kindness. If he was to help the boy, it had to be for real. Not just for one night, not for show, but for a lifetime. Come on, son, Elvis said quietly, as Jimmy laced his worn sneakers. We've got somewhere to go. The drive through Memphis felt longer than usual. Elvis's Cadillac rolled past brick warehouses and rows of shotgun houses, the city already waking with the clatter of buses and factory whistles. Jimmy pressed his face to the window, trying to mask his worry with curiosity. They pulled up outside the gray brick building of the county's child welfare office. Its windows were streaked with dust, blinds crooked, the flag out front limp in the humid air. Elvis cut the engine and glanced at Jimmy. This won't be easy. But you deserve more than back alleys and shut doors. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and stale coffee. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, illuminating linoleum floors scuffed by decades of feet. Rows of metal chairs lined the walls, filled with tired parents, crying toddlers, and teenagers staring at the floor. At the reception desk sat a balding man with wire-rimmed glasses. He looked up, startled at first, then frowned as though unimpressed. Mr. Presley, we weren't expecting you. Elvis set his hat on the counter and gestured toward Jimmy. This boy's been living on the street. I want to take responsibility for him. The man blinked slowly. Responsibility? His tone carried more suspicion than curiosity. You mean guardianship? Call it what you like, Elvis said. I won't see him sleep outside another night. The official folded his hands, voice cool and measured. With respect, celebrities come in here sometimes with grand ideas. They think a gesture makes a difference. But guardianship is paperwork, inspections, hearings, not photo opportunities. Elvis's eyes hardened. Do I look like I'm smiling for a camera? The room had gone quiet. A secretary froze mid-typing, listening. Parents in the chairs turned their heads. Jimmy tugged at Elvis's sleeve nervously, but Elvis didn't look away from the man behind the desk. "You listen to me," he said, voice low and steady. "This child's been sleeping in alleys, scraping for food. Look him in the eye and tell him that's better than me giving him a roof." The official shifted uncomfortably, his composure slipping. But before he could respond, another voice cut in from the side. "Name's Harold Carter," the newcomer said, stepping from an office doorway. He was tall, with a sharp suit and colder eyes. "I believe we've met, Mr. Presley." "I'm Jimmy's uncle." Jimmy stiffened instantly. His body shrank as though trying to disappear. Elvis placed a hand on his shoulder. "You?" Elvis asked, skepticism sharp in his tone. Carter gave a practiced smile. "Family comes first. Boy belongs with me." "Blood is blood," Jimmy's whisper broke through, trembling. "He don't want me." "He left me." Carter's smile tightened, his eyes flicking to Elvis. "Now that there's money involved, maybe I should reconsider." "A nephew of mine being cared for by Elvis Presley. Well, there's compensation the state provides for guardianship, isn't there?" The words sickened Elvis. He saw it plainly. This man didn't want Jimmy. He wanted whatever profit could be squeezed from him. "You'd drag him back just to cash a check," Elvis said, his voice quiet but searing. Carter shrugged. "Better than turning him into your next publicity stunt." Jimmy's face went pale. His hands balled into fists, eyes darting between them, panic rising. Elvis crouched, meeting the boy's gaze. "Look at me, son. You want to go with him?" Jimmy shook his head hard, his voice breaking. "No, please, don't let him." Elvis rose, turning back to the officials. "You heard him. That boy's been abandoned, and now this man shows up sniffing for money. You tell me which of us is standing here for him, not for himself." The office was silent except for the rattling of an old ceiling fan. The balding clerk shifted uneasily in his chair, caught between rules and the force of Elvis's presence. "Mr. Presley," he said finally, his tone wavering, "we can't ignore protocol. But we also can't ignore the child's wishes. There'll need to be a review. Until then, temporary guardianship may be considered." Carter's face flushed red, but he bit back his protest. Elvis simply nodded once. "Then start the papers." He placed his arm around Jimmy, guiding him toward the waiting chairs. The boy leaned against him, trembling but clinging tight, as though the choice had finally been spoken aloud. For Elvis, the victory was small. Nothing was final yet. But in that moment, he felt the shift. This wasn't a fleeting kindness anymore. It was a battle he was ready to fight, against bureaucracy, against vultures, against anyone who would strip the boy of his chance at a life. As they left the building, the sun outside seemed brighter, hotter. Elvis squinted toward it, hand still steady on Jimmy's shoulder. Fame had demanded obedience, silence, compromise. But this fight wasn't about records or crowds. It was about a boy who deserved someone in his corner, and Elvis knew he would not back down. Not this time. The Cadillac turned through the iron gates of Graceland, headlights sweeping across the stone lions that guarded the drive. Jimmy pressed his face to the window as the mansion rose before him, its white columns glowing in the night like something from another world. The house looked less like a home than a palace, and to a boy used to doorways and sidewalks, it was overwhelming. Elvis parked and killed the engine. For a moment, neither moved. Jimmy stared at the front steps, his small hands twisting in his lap. "You ready?" Elvis asked. The boy swallowed hard. "Looks too big. Like I don't belong there." Elvis rested a hand on his shoulder. "Belongin' ain't about the size of the house. Come on." They stepped into the foyer, the air cool and faintly scented with polished wood. The chandelier glittered above, and portraits of Elvis's family lined the walls. Jimmy's eyes darted from room to room. The peacock-stained glass windows, the golden records covering entire walls, the plush carpet under his feet. He moved carefully, almost tiptoeing, as if one wrong step might shatter everything. A housemaid came from the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. She froze when she saw the boy. "Mr. Presley, who—" "This is Jimmy," Elvis said simply. "He'll be staying here a while." The woman gave a polite nod, but her eyes softened as they fell on the boy's thin frame. "Welcome, honey." Jimmy didn't answer. He clutched the strap of his worn bag tighter and avoided her gaze. Later that night, Elvis walked the hall to check on him. He found the bed in the guest room untouched. Jimmy was curled in the corridor, using his bag as a pillow. Elvis crouched beside him. "Why are you out here?" The boy's eyes opened, startled. "Didn't want to mess up the room? Everything's too nice. What if I break something? Then you'll send me away." Elvis felt a pang in his chest. The child wasn't dazzled by riches. He was terrified of them. Carefully, Elvis helped him up and guided him back into the room. "A bed's for sleeping, Jimmy." "Nothing more. You can't ruin it by laying down." Jimmy hesitated, then crawled onto the mattress, stiff as a soldier. Elvis pulled the covers over him. "You don't need to earn this. Just rest." But even as the boy closed his eyes, Elvis knew it wasn't enough. Wealth couldn't erase fear. Safety wasn't found in gold-plated records. The next morning, Jimmy wandered the halls while Elvis played piano in the den. The boy paused at the doorway, staring at the walls lined with framed photographs and awards. "Feels like a museum," he muttered. "Not a home." Elvis's hands stilled on the keys. The words struck deep because they were true. Graceland had long been both sanctuary and prison, filled with treasures, but often empty of peace. That evening, Elvis called one of the staff aside. The maid confessed quietly that Jimmy had asked to sleep in the hallway again. "He says he don't want to touch what isn't his?" Elvis stood in the dim light of the kitchen, his chest heavy. He had wanted to give the boy security, but he was smothering him with grandeur. Jimmy didn't need chandeliers. He needed a place where he wasn't afraid to breathe. The decision came to him with startling clarity. The following week, Elvis drove Jimmy to a modest red-brick school on the outskirts of Memphis, Hume's High, the very place he himself had once attended. The building hadn't changed much. Paint peeling on the window frames, the flag out front fluttering tiredly in the wind. Jimmy frowned, gripping the seatbelt. "Why here?" Elvis turned to him, voice steady. "Because this is where I learned I could be more than what the world thought. And I think you need that too. Not limousines, not mansions, just a chance to grow." He crouched so they were eye level. "I'll be here every week. You'll see me. But this ain't about living in my shadow. It's about finding your own light." Jimmy's mouth opened, then closed. Finally, he whispered, "You mean I get to be just me?" Elvis smiled, gentle and proud. "That's the whole idea." The boy's eyes glistened, but this time not with fear. Back at Graceland that evening, Elvis sat alone at the piano, fingers drifting across the keys. The house felt as grand and hollow as ever. Yet for once, he sensed he was doing something that mattered beyond fame. He wasn't rescuing Jimmy with riches. He was giving him the one thing that had saved Elvis himself long ago, the chance to believe in tomorrow. The mansion around him shimmered with trophies and gold, but none of it weighed as much as the small, unspoken promise he had just made. Months passed. Memphis rolled from summer heat into autumn's golden light. Jimmy was no longer the gaunt, suspicious boy Elvis had first met on a street corner. He carried himself differently now, shoulders a little straighter, steps less hesitant. School had given him a rhythm, and Elvis's steady visits had given him something even rarer: certainty. Elvis kept his promise. Every week he appeared, sometimes in a Cadillac, sometimes quietly slipping in the back so the teachers wouldn't fuss. He sat through school plays, listened to Jimmy's halting attempts at reading assignments, and shared hamburgers at a small diner where no one dared ask too many questions anymore. But whispers still trailed them. Reporters sniffed at the story, some skeptical, others curious. Elvis ignored the noise. His focus was on the boy, not the headlines. Then came the night of the benefit concert. The Mid-South Coliseum roared with anticipation. More than 10,000 filled the seats, their cheers rumbling like thunder. Spotlights swept the crowd, then cut across the stage as Elvis stepped into view, in a white jumpsuit adorned with a phoenix across the chest. The noise was deafening. Screams, applause, the collective hunger of an audience that had come to worship their king. But Elvis's thoughts were elsewhere. In the wings, barely visible behind a curtain, Jimmy stood in a borrowed suit jacket that hung too loose on his thin frame. His hands twisted nervously, but his eyes never left Elvis. Elvis gripped the microphone, his usual grin absent. He let the noise die down before speaking. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice deep and steady, "tonight ain't just about music. It's about something bigger." The audience quieted, sensing the weight in his tone. "There's a boy here with me tonight. His name's Jimmy. I met him on the streets of this city, singing my songs to nobody but the night. He'd lost more than any child should, but he reminded me of something I'd near forgotten. That I was once a poor boy too, praying somebody would see me." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Elvis gestured to the side. "Jimmy, come on out here." The boy froze, then stepped hesitantly into the glare of the spotlight. The audience erupted. Confusion, surprise, applause mingled together. Jimmy squinted against the brightness, trembling until Elvis took his hand. "Don't be afraid, son," Elvis whispered into the mic, though his words carried to every corner of the arena. Turning back to the crowd, he said, "This child's story ain't unique. There are thousands like him. But tonight, he stands here so the world can see what hope looks like when somebody reaches out." He motioned to a stagehand for his guitar. The familiar weight settled in his arms. Elvis strummed a few quiet chords. The arena hushed in anticipation. Then he began to sing, "When you walk through a storm, hold your head up high." The words of "You'll Never Walk Alone" poured into the vast hall, solemn and stirring. His voice was rawer than his usual stage power, trembling at moments, but all the more human for it. Jimmy clung to his hand, eyes wide, lips trembling. By the chorus, the audience began to rise to their feet, singing with him. Thousands of voices joined, echoing like a hymn, filling the cavernous space with something larger than spectacle: solidarity. Elvis glanced down at Jimmy. The boy wasn't crying. Instead, his face carried something new: belonging. For once, he wasn't invisible. He was part of a chorus that refused to let him walk alone again. As the final note rang out, the Coliseum erupted into applause that shook the rafters. Flashbulbs burst like stars. Yet for Elvis, the true victory wasn't the ovation. It was the boy standing beside him, no longer hidden, no longer voiceless. The next morning, newspapers across the country carried the story. Headlines spoke not of scandal or spectacle, but of compassion. Elvis gives homeless boy a home. King of Rock extends his hand to the lost. For once, the press painted not the caricature of a celebrity, but the portrait of a man. Legal papers followed swiftly. With the eyes of the public watching, no judge dared deny what was plainly right. Temporary guardianship became permanent. Jimmy was no longer an orphan drifting between shadows. He had a place, a protector, and a future. But perhaps more important than any decree was what Jimmy whispered to Elvis that night as they drove back through the quiet streets of Memphis. His voice was small, but steady. "You sang for everybody out there, but when you held my hand, it felt like you were singing just for me." Elvis gripped the wheel, throat thick with emotion. "That's because I was, son, always was." The lights of Graceland came into view, glowing softly in the darkness. For years, Elvis had filled that house with riches, with trophies, with noise. Yet for the first time, as Jimmy leaned against him and closed his eyes, it felt like a home. And though the world would always call him king, Elvis knew the truth. His greatest crown wasn't gold or rhinestones. It was the trust of a boy who had once been lost, and now, finally, was found.